in the press. For instance, there is a chapter in Brian Stevenson's bestseller, Just Mercy, which discusses this case. There is a chapter in Nick Kristof's bestseller, Tightrope, which discusses this case. There's also a Starbucks documentary seen by more than 10 million viewers that is about this case, that is about Debbie Bakery, who forgave Ian Manuel for the crime he committed against her. But this book, as a memoir, as a personal book, is more than that story that is known. This is a book that takes us deep into the mind of a human being living in extremis. Ian Manuel spent about 2/3 of his life in prison. He was released when he was 36 years old. 18 of those years he spent in solitary confinement, largely because of his rebelliousness, but also largely because he suffered from bipolar depression and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So this is a book that demands your empathy. It commands your empathy. And I'll give you just a taste of it to give you a sense of its urgency and how it reads. Imagine that you, at age 15, have been sentenced to social death, life without parole, in a space 9 feet by 7, the size of a freight elevator, where for 22 to 24 hours a day, you are trapped. We're in a deadly daily routine. You sleep, wake up, shit, piss, eat, food slip through a slot as if you were an animal, where you are denied the possibility of human contact except as physical or mental abuse, where visual and sensory stimuli, the stuff of life, are only a memory or a dream, and where who you are is defined only by your willingness or unwillingness to be disciplined and punished. Imagine life without hope in a brutal hellhole of sameness designed to break your spirit and challenge your sanity. The United Nations considers solitary confinement for more than 15 days torture. It was my condition for 18 consecutive years. Scientists have shown that the solitary confinement of adults, but especially of juveniles, can damage the brain, as it can provoke panic, anxiety, depression, loss of control, and even suicide. I managed to endure it and survive. Raw, wrenching, ultimately inspiring. This is a brilliant, brilliant book that evokes with ferocity the power of human will over adversity. I invite all of you to read this extraordinary book, and I hope you have questions galore about it and for me as its editor. One of the extraordinary things about Ian, who now works for the city of New York, is that he is an astonishing poet who practices slam poetry, power poetry. So if you so desire, you might check him out on YouTube to give you a flavor of what he's all about. Okay. The foreword will be written by Brian Stevenson, who has been an advocate of Ian, and who, in fact, whose organization, EJI, in fact, engineered legally Ian's release from the hellhole of Florida's prison system. Any questions?
I'd love to ask a question, actually. Did Ian, was he writing while he was imprisoned, would you say? Or was he kind of thinking about recalling some of this, you know,
was able
as he said,
he wrote a manuscript during a stint in solitary confinement. During a period of 2 weeks, he furiously wrote a memoir up to the age of 15 when he entered solitary confinement, and found that writing about solitary confinement was too painful at the time to put it down on paper. So we have him, his first production was a manuscript up to the age of 15.
Well, thank you, Erroll. We're actually going to save, if anyone has any other questions for Erroll, we'll save them till the end after we're done completely. So hold on to your questions. Write them in the chat if you need to, and if you think you're going to forget. Okay. Erroll, did you have anything else you want to say? I didn't want to completely cut you off.
No, not at all. I hope I've given you the gist of this book.
Oh yeah, for sure. I'm super interested in it. Solitary confinement is no joke. Up next, for one of the editors we're meeting from PRH is Susanna Porter, and she's with Ballantine.
Great. Thank you, Melanie. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good. Okay. So I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to talk to you all. Thank you. I just want to mention I'm calling from down east Maine, which is just about as far away from California as you can get. But I did want to start today by saying how very sorry I am about the terrible fires all you Californians have been suffering through. And we on the East Coast are watching it with horror and with sympathy, and my heart goes out to you all. So I did want to start out by saying that. So I'm here to talk to you today about two of my upcoming books on our Spring 21 list. One from a well-known best-selling author and one from a newcomer, and both I think are equally promising. I'll start with a writer I believe you will have heard of, Paula McLean, author of 3 best-selling historical novels, The Paris Wife and Love and Ruin, novels about Hemingway's first and third wives, Hadley Hemingway and Martha Gellhorn. And they were as different as 2 women can be, and so were the novels about them. And in between those 2 novels, Paula wrote a wonderful novel called Circling the Sun about Beryl Markham, the English-born aviator and adventurer. But after 3 historical novels, Paula wanted a new challenge. So instead of another historical, she's turned to contemporary suspense. But that said, she knew her strength has always been to tell a story from the point of view of a living, breathing female character. I mean, in each of her Hemingway novels, he's definitely a supporting character, if not generally very supportive. It's the women who are the stars of those books. So in that sense, this change of genre isn't a total departure for her, but one that plays to one of her great strengths as a writer. Paula says that she actually had a vision for When the Stars Go Dark. Not in a celestial flash exactly, but actually when she was out on a long walk with her dog. First of all, she envisioned the setting. Some of you will know that Paula is a native Californian. She was raised in Fresno by foster parents, and in her 20s, she spent a good deal of time in Mendocino and fell in love with the town and the surrounding landscape. And as she describes it, the rocky bluffs, the relentless sea, the deep and mysterious quiet of the redwood forests, the eerie coastal fog that makes you feel as if you're caught in a strange dream. And once she had that setting, the idea for the story rushed in. A missing girl, a small town in crisis, and her main character, Anna Hart, a 35-year-old missing persons detective with a tragedy in her recent past that can only be that can only be healed, she realizes, by focusing on someone else's tragedy in the present. Paula says that this is the most deeply personal novel she's ever written. Maybe because the Mendocino setting meant so much to her, she decided to infuse the novel with something else from her own past, her own childhood in foster care. So Detective Anna Hart shares Paula's past as a foster child. Anna is rescued from a problem home and raised by loving foster parents in Mendocino who open up a whole new world to her. Paula has set the novel in 1993 when she found in her research, Paula is an avid researcher, she found that that year saw a rash of real-life abductions of young girls in California, abductions that actually occurred in roughly the same area as Mendocino. Most memorable among them was the kidnapping of 12-year-old Polly Klaas from the bedroom of her home in Petaluma while her two young girlfriends watched and her mother slept in a nearby room. It was a horror story that triggered every parent's worst fears and set in motion the largest manhunt in California's history. Polly Klaas's abduction and two other real cases are woven into the background of When the Stars Go Dark. And as you can imagine, this frightening truth behind Paula's fictional story of the kidnapping of a 15-year-old girl named Cameron makes the novel all the more chillingly real. The search to find Cameron while she's still alive makes this book a page-turner, but there's much more to the story than that. Parallel to the search is Anna Hart's struggle to pull herself away from her memories of her own personal loss and use her search to save a life, to save Cameron's life, as a way to heal. When the Stars Go Dark is full of marvelous characters, including the local sheriff, Anna's friend since childhood, local artists and aging hippies, and a psychic, all of who are typical inhabitants of a town like Mendocino. And as well, there are the difficult parents of the kidnapped girl who are suffering, but won't admit that their daughter may have been complicit in her own abduction. We've got some wonderful early endorsements. Kristen Hanna calls When the Stars Go Dark a beautifully written, sharply observed literary thriller with an extraordinary, unforgettable heroine and a twisty plot with a surprise ending. And Chris Pavoni calls it a richly satisfying, tremendously moving mystery, haunting, poignant, lyrical, urgent, unique, unforgettable. When you read the novel yourselves, I really think you'll agree. Paula McLean has embarked on a new and exciting phase of her career. So let me switch over quickly to an author who's just beginning her fiction career with the publication of her debut novel, The Dictionary of Lost Words. It's written by Pip Williams, a British woman who now lives in Adelaide, Australia. And it's there that the novel was first published earlier this year to fabulous reviews and weeks on their bestseller lists, which is actually hard to achieve because the Australian bestseller lists are usually dominated by American and British bestsellers. Pip Williams has always loved words, so when a friend recommended that she read The Professor and the Madman, that wonderful nonfiction book some of you will remember by Simon Winchester, that described the creation of the first Oxford English Dictionary in 1901, Pip devoured it. But then she was bothered by the fact that all of the dictionary's editors were male. And this in turn made her wonder what words these scholarly men might have chosen to omit from their version of the English language. So Pip dove into the esteemed dictionary's archives, and sure enough, she discovered contributions made by female academics, most of them volunteers, as well as female assistants and wives, none of whose work was ever publicly acknowledged. And so evolved the inspiration for this novel. Pip decided to create a young woman named Esme, who grows up among these lexicographers, the daughter of one of them, who does her level best to save the words they deemed unworthy of their dictionary. How she goes about this is the story of the Dictionary of Lost Words, as Esme realizes she has to leave the comfortable sanctuary of Oxford and go out into the world to see how other people live and how they speak. And who do you think was the first author I approached for a possible blurb? Well, Simon Winchester, of course. And Pip and I couldn't have been more thrilled when he loved her novel and willingly apologized that his book failed to put more focus on the women involved. The Dictionary of Lost Words has now been sold in 12 foreign languages, and we've gotten some terrific early praise from Winchester and also from Geraldine Brooks and Thomas Keneally, with more to come. We're thinking this gem of a novel could well be our spring season sleeper. We know it will appeal to everyone who loves words, and that surely includes all of us. Thanks so much for listening, and stay safe.
Thank you so much, Susanna. Both those books sound excellent, and I really like the covers.
Aren't they great? Yeah.
Yeah, they're both really good covers.
Super, thank you.
All right, so up next we have Sally Kim from Putnam.
I wish I didn't have so much editing to do. I would like to read all of these books I've been hearing about one day. Thank you so much for having me. I was born and raised in California. Most of my family still live in California, so it's always a thrill to have a chance to talk to California booksellers. So, The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr. I've been really lucky to publish a few debut novels over the past 25 years, but I will tell you, none of them quite like The Prophets by Robert Jones Jr., which we published this January. I remember when Robert's agent first called to pitch this book to me, and he said almost sheepishly, "Sally, the only book I can really compare this to is Beloved." And I remember laughing on the phone. I said, how can I go into a room full of my colleagues and make that claim? But I started reading this manuscript that very night, and I saw very quickly that he was right. So normally I try to read submissions as quickly as I can, because for every one manuscript I have, there are 10 waiting in the queue. But I found myself actually physically slowing myself down, wanting to savor the lines, the language of this book, because they were so deliberate and they had their very distinct rhythm. So I even went as far as to call the agent the next morning, and I told him, look, I know other editors are calling you in a mad rush, excited, but I refuse to read my rush of this book because it deserves to be read carefully. Even if this takes me out of the running, because I'm going to enjoy this book for what it was meant to be. Fortunately, it didn't take me out of the running, but it was worth it to me to kind of take that stance. But as beautiful as this book and the language is, what's amazing is how quickly the pages actually do turn. This is a book that is so rooted in plot. And a little side note, it's, you know, the author, Robert, grew up devouring comic books, and you actually see that influence here and there. It's in little spurts, but it's definitely an influence that I think really benefits the plot. So The Prophets is the story of two enslaved men, Samuel and Isaiah, in antebellum South, and the love and the human refuge that they find in each other. You see, as you start to read the story, how Samuel and Isaiah's relationship comes to threaten everyone on the plantation around them, and actually leads to a pretty stunning betrayal that threatens their lives. Each page, though, as Robert unveils, builds to this sort of almost unbearable crescendo of tension. It's a book that I always describe sort of ends on a climax. And you actually don't see this climax coming until it's actually happening, which is very, very difficult to pull off as a writer. But also very difficult to pull off is the fact that the ending is as inevitable as it is surprising. And I promise you, you will never forget this ending. The Prophets is undeniably a dark story because of its truths. And even though it's an historical novel, you'll be amazed by how timely it feels, especially today. In fact, during the year and a half that I've been working with Robert, the book has felt ever more like an unflinching mirror to our times, day by day by day. But here's the interesting thing. It somehow incredibly is ultimately so life-affirming and joyful. When people ask me, what is The Prophets about? I tell them the plot line, I tell them the log line, but I also say, this book is a celebration of love in all of its forms, the enormous heroic power of love. I'm always reminded of the beautiful endorsement that Ocean Vuong gave for this book, and I promise not to read the whole blurb, but he said, the Prophets reminded him of how the best literature can be both, quote, a scalpel and a balm. So this combination of strengths is why, even though this is probably one of the most literary books Putnam has published in recent years, it's one that we really feel has wide appeal and why we're so excited about it. it actually calls to mind a book we published earlier this year, Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reed, which is a very different book to be sure. But I compared these two books because that book also managed to be as entertaining as a novel as it was also a vehicle for people to talk about things, race and privilege, that we often avoid talking about. So this is what this book is. So now, so much to say about Robert Jones Jr., the author. Robert spent 10 years writing this book. He is the 6th generation Robert Jones. He is the descendant of enslaved people. He received his MFA from Brooklyn College, where he studied with writers such as Jenny Offel and Michael Cunningham, who once told him, quote, "You will win a Pulitzer one day." So Robert can clearly write. But what's more interesting, or almost as interesting, is that he's a literary writer who comes with that rare platform. He's the voice behind the very popular social justice platform, Son of Baldwin, which has a very, very dedicated following of around 300,000 people across all the social media. And by dedicated, I mean they check their feeds every day, multiple times a day, to get their news from Robert. He spends at least 2 hours a day writing and posting about politics and current events, and it really, really shows. He's very open about the fact that you can't separate his activism from his art. And you know that feeling you get when you're reading something and you just know that the writer was born to write that book? This is that book. This is The Prophets. If Robert had a life mantra, it would be Toni Morrison's missive that, quote, "If you find a book you really want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it." Robert was long troubled by the notion that he was raised with, that a love like Samuel and Isaiah's would be the result of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy or something that was deranged or wrong. In the antebellum period, queerness was often presented in the context of rape, which prompted Robert to ask a question: what about love? So he researched, and he did a lot of research to provide the voice of pre-colonial African motherland in this book. It's threaded really sparingly throughout the book, but it really shapes the story. Sometimes it addresses the reader, sometimes it whispers in the ear of a character, and it's so incredibly powerful. There's actually a line in the very beginning of the book. In the many times that I read this book and edited it, I found myself skipping over that line because it would make me cry. And I don't have time to cry when I'm editing, but that's how powerful and how deliberate each sentence in this book really is. I'll never forget something Robert said to me in our very, very first conversation. Because I asked him, what does this book mean to you? What do you want people to take away from this book? And he said, "The Prophets is a story not of our ancestors' enslavement, but of their liberation." And I remember feeling sort of a jolt when he said that. I had this feeling that, you know, all the books and all the years I've spent in this industry editing, you know, I've worked to this moment to really have this opportunity, but not only an opportunity, but a responsibility to play even just a small role in ushering Robert's debut into this world. With this book, he's really shown, and all of his work up until now, not only to be able to be part of the conversation, but to help lead it. So, okay, indulge me one more endorsement quote, and only because it just came into my inbox. And this is from Marlon James, who said, quote, "The Prophets shakes right down to the bone what the American novel is, should do, and can be. That shuffling sound you hear is Morrison, Baldwin, and Angela whooping and hollering, both in pride and in wonder." We all kind of shed a tear when that quote came into my inbox. So, you know, we had originally planned to take Robert around the country to meet all of you this fall. And so it sort of breaks my heart. And I know it's breaking his heart to pieces that he won't be able to meet you in person, at least for now. So for now, please do check out theprophetsportal.com, which has a lot of information about the book, but most importantly has a little welcome video from Robert. It's his way of greeting you, the bookseller. So I'd love for you to meet him that way for now. So, okay, I could clearly go on and on, so I'll stop here. But if you do have a chance to read the book, I would really, truly love to hear from you. And I know Robert would too. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Sally. That book sounds amazing. You really hit it for me when you said such a fun age and beloved. So those are, and then that quote at the end that you just got. I mean, if that doesn't make you want to read that book, I don't know what will.